Hi, my name is Fabian Super. I work as a solutions architect for Intercept already 12 years, and I started in IT 27 years ago. I started fixing laptops with a screwdriver. And nowadays, I help customers in their journey towards Azure, and I have a focus on identity. And that is also where this presentation is about. I want to show you the possibilities about identity protection and about application security within Entra ID. So I first want to go through the basics. What is Microsoft Entra ID, MFA, conditional access, PIM, identity protection, all possibilities within in the Entra ID tenant to protect your identities. So Microsoft Entra ID, it's an identity and access management solution from Microsoft that helps you to manage and secure identities for hybrid and multi-cloud environments. And you can link your on-premises Active Directory to Microsoft Entra ID. You can join your devices. You can publish on-premises applications to Microsoft Entra ID, publish SaaS applications in Microsoft Entra ID, and it has different features like multi-factor authentication, conditional access, PIM, which we will walk through in the upcoming slides. So you can enable multi-factor authentication within Entra ID. There are different ways to do this, and it's the best practice is to don't mix these methods together. At first, we have security defaults. This requires, it's a default, tenant-wide default setting. It requires administrators to do MFA. It blocks legacy authentication, and it protects privileged activities with MFA. We have per user multi-factor authentication. So you can say on a particular user, hey, I want to enable or enforce multi-factor authentication for a particular user. We have conditional access, which applies multi-factor authentication based on if-then statements. And we have mandatory MFA, and this is Microsoft enforced multi-factor authentication. So Microsoft started doing this because MFA can block more than 99% of account compromise attacks. And Microsoft started with this at a small scope for Azure sign-in attempts since October last year, and this took around 6 months to complete, and it finished in March this year. And since the beginning of October this year, the enforcement is also there when signing into the rest of the services too. So like the Azure CLI, Azure PowerShell, and infrastructure as code tools, all tools to use to manage your Azure resources, right? So this enforcement is called mandatory MFA. So with mandatory MFA, your break glass or emergency access account is also enforced with MFA. So these accounts should therefore have certificate or passkey as a second factor and should be put in the conditional access exclusion list to ensure access if there's an issue with blocked policies, for instance. And furthermore, should these be cloud-only accounts? So that use the onmicrosoft.com domain, and they should be federated or synchronized from an on-premises environment. So with mandatory MFA, all users who access any administration portal should use MFA, and that is just not configurable. So it's implemented separately from any access policies that you configured in your tenant. And if you want to be in control, use conditional access. And user identities that are used now as service accounts need to fulfill multi-factor authentication now too, but they can't. And that is why you have these to be migrated to workload identities by now, right? So workload identities, applications and services also need identities. And these are called workload identities or service principals. They allow applications to access resources on our behalf. and more solutions are reliant on non-human entities to complete tasks, and the number of non-human identities is increasing dramatically. And recent cyber attacks show that attackers are increasingly targeting non-human identities over human identities. The challenge is workload identities don't behave like users. They can't perform MFA, and they usually don't have a proper lifecycle process. And their secrets or certificates have to be stored somewhere, right? So they can become a weak spot if not managed carefully. And to secure them, we can use conditional access policies specifically for workload identities. For example, to only allow them from trusted locations. But even better, wherever possible, we should replace secrets and certificates with managed identities. And these take care of credential management automatically, so we don't need to worry about storing keys. Another best practice is to always apply least privilege for workload identities. Don't give a service principal more permissions than it truly needs. And finally, of course, we need visibility, right? So by monitoring workload identity usage with Defender for Cloud apps, for instance, we can then spot unusual behavior or misuse before it becomes a real incident. So with all this multi-factor authentication everywhere, you don't want to do multi-factor authentication multiple times. And therefore you can use external identity cross-tenant access settings to manage collaboration with other Entra tenants through B2B collaboration. Cross-tenant access settings provide control over inbound and outbound access, allowing you to trust multi-factor authentication from other Entra ID organizations, as we can see in the picture here. So if a person in tenant A wants to access a resource in tenant B, this person only needs to do multi-factor authentication in tenant A. And there's also now in preview still external authentication method. An external authentication method is about delegating the multi-factor authentication step to an external provider like Ping, Duo or RSA, and this means you are not restricted to using only Entra's native authentication methods. So conditional access, as already said, is based on if-then statements. It is a policy-based engine that evaluates signals like where is the user located, the location, who is the user, device state, or an application that he wants to access to decide whether to allow or block access. And this way you can enforce security requirements such as multi-factor authentication, compliant devices, or trusted locations before granting access to applications and data. So a user must, for instance, use a device that is compliant. It has a virus scanner, it has the latest updates, and when all is set, the user can sign into the application he wants to access. And if it's not, it might be possible it needs to do multi-factor authentication. So all if-then statements you can set within conditional access. And there's also privileged identity management, right? In short, PIM, which helps you to secure access to resources by allowing users to activate privileged roles only when needed. So it supports just-in-time access, approval workflows, time-bound role assignments to reduce standing administrative permissions. And the user can, for instance, use a role only within start and end dates, which is called time-bound active access. So in the picture here we see a privileged user that requests access to a specific admin role, but the user needs to do multi-factor authentication first. And then an approval request is sent to another user, his manager, for instance. He needs to approve it first, and after approval, the role gets activated for a specific amount of time. So the users then may be able to use this role only for 2 or 4 hours to get the job done. And you can use PIM for Entra ID roles, but also for access to Azure resources. We also have Microsoft Entra ID Protection, and this helps detect, investigate, and respond to identity-based risks. And it does this using AI and real-time signals from Microsoft's global threat intelligence. So Microsoft Entra ID Protection is built on Microsoft's experience protecting consumer identities and gain accuracy from over 78 trillion security signals a day. And there are 600 million attacks on Microsoft customers per day. So it can use all this information to protect your identity. So it can automatically detect risky sign-ins and users based on behavior, faulty locations, faulty devices, these kind of threat signals. And it can give you insights in identity threats. And it can then enforce adaptive access policies, such as requiring MFA or just blocking access when the risk is really high. You can even integrate identity protection alerts with Microsoft Sentinel. So you can view dashboards, create custom alerts, and improve from their investigation. And it is also always a good idea to save your Entra ID data into a log analytics workspace. Not only for long-term retention, but also to monitor for suspicious activities and to gain insights yourself. And you can then use KQL queries to search, filter, and analyze logs. For instance, to identify all sign-ins from an unfamiliar locations, or all sign-ins which use legacy protocols, or all sign-ins, all risky users. And you can then even build custom dashboards and visualizations using custom workbooks in Azure Monitor, just to visualize trends. And we have, of course, the Identity Secure Score. The Identity Secure Score is just located within your Entra ID tenant, and it tells you what improvements you can make to get a better score. So if you look here, I can disable the exploration of passwords to gain a better score, or do not allow users to grant consent to unreliable applications. So I can disable that also. Or I can use insider risk conditioning, conditional access. These are all free recommendations I can use to improve my secure score, my identity secure score within my tenant. So we've all spent the last few years strengthening our identity protection. And like I just showed, we can use multi-factor authentication, conditional access, privileged identity management, and these are hopefully now standard in most organizations. But attackers are creative, right? And if they can't steal a password or bypass MFA, they'll look for another way in. And one of the biggest blind spots today is our SaaS applications. And every time we connect new applications to Entra ID, we extend our attack surface. And these apps are granted tokens, permissions, and in many cases, persistent access to sensitive data. So in the next slides, I would just want to go through some stuff of what these risks look like and what we can do to close these gaps. So consent phishing. Consent phishing is like phishing for credentials, but instead of stealing passwords, attackers trick users into granting permissions. And they register a fake application that looks legitimate, send the user a link, and the user clicks accept on the consent screen. And from that moment on, the attacker's application has the same permissions the user just granted, often to read email, access files, without ever needing a password. And this technique bypasses MFA entirely because it doesn't involve logging in as the user. It simply uses the access the user granted. So the best defense against consent phishing is controlling what users can consent to. And in Entra ID, you can restrict user consent pre-approve only low-risk permissions for verified applications, and require admin approval for anything else. And educating employees is also important. If they understand what the consent screen means, they're less likely to click accept blindly. And you should also routinely audit applications and consented permissions within the organization to make sure that applications are accessing only the data they need and are adhering to the principles of least privilege. And you should also block consent phishing emails with Microsoft Defender for Office 365 by protecting against phishing campaigns where an attacker is impersonating a known user within the organization. And since August, I believe Microsoft now also has the option to let Microsoft manage the consent settings. And the conditions included in that policy are automatically updated based on Microsoft's latest security recommendations for end-user consent. And this is therefore the recommended setting. You can see it on the lower top screenshot of this slide. So consent phishing happens most of the time through applications from unverified publishers. If an app comes from a verified publisher, you'll see a small blue badge confirming that Microsoft has validated the organization behind it. But many applications don't have this badge. These are unverified publishers, and that is where the risk comes in, right? So an attacker or attackers can easily register an application, give it a friendly name like Outlook Sync Helper, for instance, and trick users into granting consent. And once approved, the attacker gains a long-lived token. They don't need multi-factor authentication, and even password resets won't revoke that access. So to prevent this, we can require that only verified publishers are allowed, restrict user consent, and route new application requests through an admin consent workflow, like shown before. So tools like Defender for Cloud Applications also help us spot these unverified or risky apps in the environment. And even legitimate apps can be risky if they request more permissions than they need. We see this a lot with custom applications where developers take shortcuts and ask for broad graph API permissions like read all mailboxes or manage all users, even when the app only needs a fraction of that access. And if that application ever gets compromised, the attacker instantly inherits all those privileges. It's the app equivalent of giving the new intern global admin rights, just in case, right? So this is why permission minimization, just like least privilege for users, is so critical for applications. So review each application permission regularly. You need to have the insights and compare requested scopes to what the application actually needs. So when an OAuth or OpenID Connect application is registered in Entra ID, it must specify one or more redirect URIs, and the so-called Uniform Resource Identifier. And these URIs tell Entra ID where to send the authorization code or access token after the user signs in. And if these URIs are too broad, when wildcards are used, or point to domains you don't control, or include insecure schemes, an attacker could register a lookalike endpoint and capture the token during the redirect flow. So the redirect URIs are hijackable, and the risk is then an account takeover can take place, right? So once tokens are captured, attackers can impersonate users or server principals. Or data exfiltration can happen. Attackers can silently access mail, files, or APIs without credentials. Or privilege escalation. So if the app has excessive permissions, the attacker inherits all of them. So the solution then is use exact URIs only. So make sure your application registration use exact trusted redirect URIs only. No wildcards. no unused development URLs, no test subdomains. And you should use domains you control. Ensure redirect URIs point to domains under your ownership and HTTPS secured. And review it regularly. Periodically audit registered application in Entra Admin Center application ownership. Application ownership should be kept to a minimal as set of people within the organization. And an administrator should review the owners also. Review the list once every few months to make sure that owners are still part of the organization and should still own an application. And apps with a verified publisher are less likely to abuse redirect URIs. And you should also remove unused URIs and delete any stale or deprecated redirect URIs from the application registration. And you should use conditional access for applications. Apply conditional access policies to sensitive applications or limit sign-ins to trusted network devices. And then we have shadow IT. The applications and services your employees sign up for without IT involvement. They might use their corporate account to connect to a new productivity tool or storage service, and suddenly that service has a token to your Entra ID tenant. And without visibility, you don't know which apps have access, what permissions they be granted, or who's using them. And this makes it very hard to enforce your security standards or respond to breaches. So the first thing to do is to discover what applications are actually being used. And Defender for Cloud Apps can analyze network traffic or OAuth consents and give visibility into all SaaS activity within the environment. And from there we can classify and sanction approved applications, and basically defining which ones are trusted and supported and which ones should be blocked. And this creates clarity for both users and IT. But we also need to educate users on the risks of connecting random applications to their work accounts and offer secure, approved alternatives so they don't feel the need to go around the policies. And finally, we can enforce this governance with conditional access again. For example, by limiting OAuth consent to verified applications or requiring compliant devices for access. And this way we build both visibility and control into the identity layer without blocking productivity. So I already mentioned a few times Defender for Cloud Apps, which we definitely should use to discover and monitor usage. When it comes to protecting SaaS applications, Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps plays a crucial role. In the detect phase, it automatically discovers both managed and unmanaged applications in use in your environment, and it then assesses the risk of each application based on compliance, behavior, usage patterns, and it even uses AI to flag suspicious activity like strange logins or unusual data sharing. And then it starts investigating. Defender for Cloud Apps correlates data from Entra ID and Defender XDR, allowing you to see exactly which applications access sensitive data, what permissions they have been granted through OAuth, and where information might be exposed. And to remediate this, you can, for example, enforce conditional access app control to apply session-based protection, or block or sanction risky applications, or suspend a user, or revoke OAuth tokens for a malicious application, or automated responses and alerts using Defender XDR or Microsoft Sentinel. This altogether gives you visibility, control, and response capabilities across your entire SaaS landscape. So, a lot of information in the last 20 slides. So we started with the fundamentals, Entra ID, multi-factor authentication, and building the first layer of defense. But identity security doesn't stop at users anymore. Workload identity, service principals, and external applications are part of our new reality. We looked at how conditional access and PIM helps us apply the principle of least privilege, and how Entra ID Protection adds AI-driven intelligence to detect and block risky sign-ins automatically. And then we moved into the SaaS world, where consent phishing, excessive permissions, misconfigured redirect URIs expose new attack surfaces. And Defender for Cloud closes that gap, right? So giving us visibility and control over the cloud apps our users depend on every day. So the message is clear, I think. Securing identity today means protecting not only people, but also applications and workloads. Thank you for watching.